I have come to see you, having heard of you. With the utmost of longing I came, and I praise God for the means afforded to people of the Orient to come to see the people of the Occident and make known their love for them. I am hopeful that day by day this love will increase. Thus the day may come when the East and the West may become the integral part of the world. All will be united in love and peace. The most indissoluble love shall be established among them. Abdu'l-Bahá.
So today our speaker is Dr. Robert Stockman, and he'll be talking about Abdu'l-Bahá in America. Dr. Stockman obtained his master's degree and doctorate in religious studies from Harvard University, where he specialized in the history of religion in the United States. He's the author of the Bahá'í Faith in America, volumes 1 and 2, which cover Bahá'í events in the United States from 1892 to 1900 and 1901 to 1912, respectively. Thornton Chase, the First American Bahá'í, Abdu'l-Bahá in America, a volume that reviews Abdu'l-Bahá's 8-month journey across North America, the Bahá'í Faith, a guide for the Perplexed, which is an introductory text, a book about the Bahá'í Faith and nonviolence, and various articles on Bahá'í history and theology. He's also edited The World of the Bahá'í Faith, a 51-chapter survey of the faith published by Routledge. He was the director of the Wilmette Institute 2000 to 2022 and has served on the boards of World Order magazine and the Bahá'í Encyclopedia project. He's an instructor of religious studies at Indiana University, South Bend. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Dr. Stockman.
Thank you so much, Paimone. I've got a PowerPoint, which maybe I should pull that up now. And I'll, of course, also give a little bit of an introduction to this topic. Well, thank you so much, Paimone and your whole family for inviting me today to give a presentation in your virtual series. I'm quite honored to have this opportunity, and I'm very impressed by the programming you've been doing, going on for 3 years with really quite a ongoing effort, and it's really quite impressive. You suggested that I start by saying something real quick about the Bahá'í Faith before I actually move into the slideshow itself. I'll have a lot of the information about the faith really kind of woven into it, so I'll make my introduction fairly brief. Of course, the Bahá'í Faith began in Iran in the mid-19th century. It had 2 founding figures. I won't go into too much detail, but the one that is the real major founder for the Bahá'í Faith is Baha'u'llah, 1817 to 1892. He said he was a messenger of God, a manifestation, and he then proceeded for a good 40 years of his life to reveal text. And the Bahá'í Faith, as a result, is very much a religion of the Word of God, that is, because Baha'u'llah claimed that his writings were divine revelation. And we have, I think the Bible is 400,000 or 500,000 words in length, Old and New Testaments together. Baha'u'llah revealed somewhere over 6 million words that we have of text. So we have an absolutely immense amount of stuff. I like to say that we don't have a Baha'ible, we have a scripture database. And of course now we don't even have to have prayer books because we have apps on our phones with all the prayers. So it's quite interesting how these things change over time. Baha'u'llah wrote about just about every imaginable subject because the majority of his texts were responses to people's questions. So it's something like 18,000 different documents that we have of his in the archives in our World Center in Haifa, Israel. And he wrote about everything from setting interest rates to raising children, the importance of music, how to solve world problems, the relationship between the individual and God. One can go on and on and on. He wrote in Arabic and in Persian and in a unique mixture of the two. For people of Zoroastrian background, he, of course, was an original religion in Iran that predated Islam. He, for them, actually wrote in pure Persian. That would be the Persian language with no use of Arabic words in the text that's rather like trying to write English without using any words of French or Latin background, which is actually quite difficult. And so Baha'u'llah's revelation is the founding basis for the Baha'i teachings and the beginning of the Baha'i community. The faith then, of course, spread all around the world, and there are Baha'is in every country in the world except probably Vatican City, for obvious reasons. I'm not so sure about North Korea. I've heard differing things about North Korea, but the Baha'i community, as a result, is the second most widespread religion in the world after Christianity, according to the World Christian Database, anyway. So that gives you a little bit of a background. Baha'u'llah's son was named Abdu'l-Bahá. His dates are 1844 to 1921, and he came to the United States in 1912. This was after spending a large portion of 1911 in Europe. He then went back to Egypt for the winter, and then in March of 1912, he left Egypt, stopped in Naples, Italy, briefly. The ship then continued on to New York City and arrived there in mid-April. I think it was April 12th, if I remember right. And he then was here for 8 months, then went back to Europe, traveled around Europe till about mid-1913, and then returned to Egypt and back to Akka and what is today Haifa and what is today Israel. At that time was part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire by, I think, late 1913 or early 1914, some months before World War I began. He was there, of course, during the war. After the war, he then continued to run the faith up to his passing in 1921. So my presentation talks about Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to North America and what we can learn from it. This gives you a quick idea of where he went and where he traveled. I don't know how easily you can see my cursor here. I'm moving it around in the New York City area. He arrived, of course, here in New York City in April. From there, he went down after, I think he was there for 8 or 9 days. He went down to Washington, D.C. And from Washington, D.C., after a week or so, he then went to Chicago. He was in Chicago, laid the cornerstone of the Baha'i Temple, then went back through Cleveland and Pittsburgh back to New York, spent several months working out of New York City, going up to Philadelphia, down to Philadelphia, up to Boston, etc. Then when it got very hot, he went up to New Hampshire, to Dublin, and then to Greenacre Baha'i School in southern Maine. From there, he went up to Montreal, then back down to Chicago, up to Minneapolis, through Wisconsin, then on west to Denver, all the way here to San Francisco. From San Francisco, he made a quick trip down to LA because Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i, had died there, and he went down to see Thornton Chase's grave. And then he went back, all the way back through Denver, visited the friends in Denver again, stopped in Chicago again, went back to Washington again, back to New York, and then from New York, he left in December and headed back to Europe. The ship went, I think, to Liverpool. So that gives you a bit of an idea of where he went. To give you some idea of what he did on this long trip, he was incredibly busy and prolific. And he talked, of course, frequently, several times every day. The number of talks he gave is actually difficult to know because we don't have a good record of them all. We have transcripts of the spontaneous English translations in many cases. Sometimes we have the notes of what he said in Persian, because he spoke in Persian. And it's quite interesting to watch Abdu'l-Bahá speak. You can actually do this, you know. There is a video. If you go look at the videos that are available of Abdu'l-Bahá, I think they're on YouTube. There's one where he's in Howard McNutt's backyard, and they've colorized that one. It's really quite something. And you can see Abdu'l-Bahá pacing back and forth, and he has in his hands his prayer beads, and he's doing this with his prayer beads, and you can see his mouth moving. That's Abdu'l-Bahá giving a talk to the friends Frequently, Abdu'l-Bahá, when he spoke, he walked, he paced. At the fronts of churches, he paced back and forth. He was a very active, energetic speaker this way. This is one of the amazing things about Abdu'l-Bahá was the energy he had. He was 67 years old when he came to the United States. He had rheumatism. He had had tuberculosis as a kid. His health was not good because of all those years of imprisonment. And he had so much energy that some of the individuals on his entourage said that they were totally exhausted and worn out trying to keep up with him. So it's really quite an amazing thing to contemplate what this man's energy was, his constant activity. So he spoke certainly in many homes. People would invite him to their house and he would speak there. He generally rented a house if he was in a city for more than a few days. If he was just there a few days, he stayed in a hotel. The problems with staying in a hotel, however, one was no way to cook your own food, and two, these hotels were usually segregated, which meant Black people couldn't go to them. So he generally preferred to rent a house, and when he rented a house, anyone could come to him. The house had to have a large room that could accommodate 60 to 100 people. It had to have a kitchen because they had to have tea going continuously. And then, of course, there was always breakfast, lunch, and supper for the entourage. He generally had about a dozen people traveling with him, Persians and Americans. You needed to have someone answer the phone in English, for example. He had several Persians who spoke excellent English, but they were frequently busy translating for him while he was speaking. And he generally had 1 or 2, 3 young American Baha'is, male and female, traveling with him and answering the door, answering people's questions, finding out who needed to see Abdu'l-Bahá next, these kinds of basic tasks, cleaning the house, washing the dishes, helping to cook. So he had really quite an active group of people traveling with him. He met many prominent people. He spoke in many public venues as well. He spoke in 7 settlement houses or social service agencies. And this is really quite remarkable. He spoke to kids at summer camps on several occasions. He made several visits to sick people. Over 350 newspaper articles appeared while he was in the United States. And that's the number that I was able to find in 2012. I suspect now we could probably find almost as many additional articles because there are a lot of articles that appeared in big city newspapers that we know about, but then small town newspapers would reprint by violation of copyright, usually, by the way. In those days, they didn't worry about that so much. A lot of newspapers was just reprint articles or they would shorten them. So there's probably articles scattered all over the United States in small towns about his visit. He gave at least 401 public talks in his 239 days. I made an attempt to estimate the size of the audiences. You know, is it a dozen people? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? And you add all that up and you come up to 93,000 people. Likely that it could be twice as large as that or half as many. It's kind of hard to know exactly, but that gives you some idea of the size of his audiences. He spoke in 31 liberal Protestant churches, 14 Theosophical and New Thought meetings. Note, no Catholic churches, no conservative Protestant churches, though some of the places that he spoke at actually were perhaps a little more conservative than one might think. And I don't have it listed here, maybe it's somewhere else, but he also spoke on the next slide, I've got it, in 3 synagogues. In California alone, where we have a really thorough record, 48 formal addresses, 41 small group meetings, and 53 interviews, all in 24 days. That amounts to about 6 meetings a day with individuals, small groups, or public meetings, or formal meetings. So he was quite busy. California is the one place where we have, I would say, a complete record because the Baha'is hired a young Baha'i who was a stenographer. I think they practically attached her to Abdu'l-Bahá surgically. She was there when he spoke to people in the hallways of the hotels when he was staying in hotels. She recorded his talks in automobiles as they were driving to meetings. And so we have a complete record really in California, and that gives you an idea of how much we're missing in the rest of the country. I should probably speed up, but it gives you some idea of the really amazing amount of stuff he did. Spoke at 5 universities, 3 synagogues, at the 4th annual meeting of the NAACP, at the one African American Literary Society, which was at the Mother AME Church in Washington, D.C., which is a huge church to this day. And the audience there was probably well over 1,000 people. He spoke to all kinds of different people. When he was in Boston, he met with Syrian Americans and spoke in Arabic to them because there was a large Syrian immigrant population. By Syrian today, we would say Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and that whole area. In those days, that whole thing was Syria. He spoke to Japanese Americans in Berkeley, California. He spoke in Persian. He was translated into English, and then someone else translated him into Japanese, if you can imagine how complicated that was. And a summary of that appeared in a Japanese newspaper, American Japanese newspaper. And he heavily focused on African Americans. I would say half his audience in Washington, D.C. was African American because he spoke at this AME church and in various houses in integrated sessions. His talks, if you want to think about what Abdu'l-Bahá was trying to do, this is, I think, one way to describe it. He sought to move the uninformed public into the ranks of the interested into the ranks of the inquiring into the ranks of the committed, and the committed into the ranks of the consecrated. So he was generating a centripetal force, pulling people towards the faith. And as far as they went was fine. If they were just a little interested, that was fine. If they were more interested, that was fine. If they became Baha'is, that was fine. If they became more consecrated, Barik Allah, this was all good. That was what he tried to do, and he did that with, I think, great success and energy. And that, to me, is I think, a model for us how we share the faith to others as well. Many of his talks emphasized what we today call the Baha'i principles. And he, in one case, shared 11 of them in his talks. These were usually talks to the public. And the 11 were, as you can see listed here, generally he would start with either the investigation of truth or the oneness of humanity. These really are 2 different ways of saying the same thing in a way, because the Baha'i Faith emphasizes that all people are spiritually equal before God. And Baha'u'llah says that the unique gift we have is the gift of understanding, rational thought, the ability to think about things, the ability to reason. And so independent investigation of truth is our obligation as beings capable of understanding. And the oneness of mankind is this recognition that we are all of the same stock, of the same background, and we must therefore all be accepting each other as brothers and sisters, as neighbors, as members of the same human family. So these 2 principles are the ones he emphasizes, I'd say, the most. The other principles that he emphasized all flow from these as well, the oneness of religion and science, because the gift of understanding is something that we need to investigate reality, whether it's physical reality or spiritual reality. And God, having created both spiritual reality and physical reality, they can't conflict, they can't contradict, because God is the author of both of them. And so we have the same reasoning power to use for both science and religion, and therefore, ultimately, science and religion are in harmony because they are both based on the same mechanism of exploration, exploring God's creation. If there's an apparent contradiction, it's because we haven't understand one or both of them. Abandonment of prejudice obviously also follows from this gift of understanding. Equality of men and women, universal education, because we can't investigate reality without having access to knowledge and the accumulated wisdom of humanity, which we then use as our foundation for continuing to explore reality and helping to push humanity forward. Religion must be the cause of love and unity. Abdu'l-Bahá says this is the purpose of religion. It's not to divide people, it's to provide people with these common values of morality and love that will bring us together. Equal standards of human rights. Okay, obviously that follows from the oneness of humanity. A universal auxiliary language in addition to our native languages so we can talk to each other and understand each other. And then the power of the Holy Spirit, because ultimately all of this depends upon God's assistance and guidance for it to happen. So that's really the sort of summary of the kinds of talks that he gave. And I think to this day, we find these very compelling and powerful and attractive ideas. At this time, when he came to the United States, the dominant assumption amongst white Protestants, which was the majority of the people in the country and was the dominant controlling group in the country. The dominant assumption of them was that Protestantism was the superior form of religion, white people were the superior race, and because of that, their civilization was the superior civilization. This is what one scholar of Islam in America called the conflation of race, religion, and progress. That race, religion, and progress are all related because the best people with the best religion are bringing about the progress. Abdu'l-Bahá did not come out and say this is stupid. He just simply provided the alternative. He said that he replaces race with the oneness of humanity, that all humanity is one. He replaces Christianity with the oneness of religion. And so you have the world's religions all helping to bring about progress. And the progress is spiritual progress. Material progress is very good. Material civilization can be very great and helpful for people, but ultimately spiritual civilization is the goal. He was gentle in his tone. He very rarely criticized people directly. He did occasionally. I can cite some examples of that, but it was unusual, and it was generally not in public either. It was more likely comments he made privately. And this whole idea of the oneness of humanity was not, in a sense, a new idea. The Unitarians frequently said they believed in the brotherhood of man, and this was, I'd say, an idea, a common idea for most of the liberal Protestants, that they believed in the brotherhood of man. But their notion of the brotherhood of man was not the same as the Bahá'í notion of the brotherhood of man. And I think probably the best example of this is Abdu'l-Bahā's encouraging of interracial marriage. When Abdu'l-Bahá was in Boston, he spoke to the Unitarians. The Unitarians had an annual convention every year, and they invited him. He spoke to the annual convention of the Unitarians. 2 days later, there was another religious conference of the Free Religious Association in Boston. He spoke to them as well. And the host of the Free Religious Association said, as he introduced Abdu'l-Bahá, I would say it was a put down, frankly. He says, I was walking across Boston Common with a friend of mine the other day. We were talking about Abdu'l-Bahā's talk to the Unitarians, and my friend said, no, he didn't say anything new to us. It was all things we already believed. And then this host introducing Abdu'l-Bahá said, isn't this amazing and marvelous that a man from Persia would believe the same thing that we believe? That's why I say it's a bit of a put down. But Abdu'l-Bahā's notion of the oneness of humanity included some twists and turns that the Unitarians might not have followed. None of those Unitarians would have advocated that their white daughters marry a black man. And Abdu'l-Bahá was very busily encouraging Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew to consider getting married. He had done most of that actually in April, and in early May, they finally asked him, so are you trying to encourage us to consider getting married? He said this separately to first Louisa and then later Louis. He said, yes, but it's up to you. I can't tell you to do this. It's not my business. Marriage is not a required thing. It's up to you. And so they started thinking about it around May 1st, and they got married on September the 30th. And this, of course, was the first interracial marriage in the American Baha'i community. Excuse me. When they made the decision to get married, Abdu'l-Bahá was in Dublin, New Hampshire at that time. This is Dublin Lake in southern New Hampshire was a place where many wealthy people had their large summer houses. They would go there to get away from the heat and humidity of the cities. Of course, they talked about the heat and humidity. Frankly, it was mostly the heat, humidity, and the air pollution. The cities were very badly polluted in those days. And when Abdu'l-Bahá was in New York City in June and July, the people with him were afraid that he would die from the air pollution. Of course, they said it was the heat and humidity. People didn't have this phrase smog in those days. He breathed much better in Dublin, and that's why he went there. All the people in Dublin were white except for their servants. They brought their black cooks and maids with them. And on a Sunday, Abdu'l-Bahá was able to meet with the African-American servants because that's their day off. He couldn't do this in someone's house, God forbid. But he was able to use a boathouse down on the shore of the lake. He met with the African-American servants and he told them about the plan of the Gregories to get married. And they were, of course, quite impressed and very pleased to hear about this. It shocked the American Baha'is, many of them. Some people said, we're not ready for this. We understand this idea of the oneness of humanity, but really interracial marriage? Why now? For the next 40 years, the Gregories were this interracial presence in Baha'i meetings. And that had probably more of an impact on helping the American Baha'is understand what the oneness of humanity meant than just about anything you can imagine. So this was, I think, a very important accomplishment by Abdu'l-Bahá. He also emphasized the equality of men and women. And this time in 1912, there was a lot of debate about whether women should be able to vote or not. In 1912, several states in the West had already given women the vote, Wyoming in 1869, Utah in 1870, and again in 1895, because they took it away from the women in between. There is, by the way, in the Utah state capitol, a big mural of frontier people voting, and the first person in the front of the line is a woman putting her ballot into the ballot box. It's really quite a nice mural. So the Utahns, the Mormons, were very proud that they had done this, I think. But this was not something that was common in most of the country. I believe it was in 1912, California agreed to give women the right to vote, but Tammany Hall in New York City was opposed to it because they knew the women would vote for reform, and Tammany Hall was trying to maintain its machine control over the city. Abdu'l-Bahá frequently emphasized that women should have the right to vote. It made headlines on several occasions. And he said that the inequality between men and women was generally caused by their lack of education. He emphasized that if women have less physical strength than men, this is no longer an issue because of all the machines that are available. And he said that women, if they were properly trained, could even be soldiers and fight as well as men on the battlefield. This is, I think, quite interesting, and no doubt that would have been a bit shocking in 1912. Of course, it was still another 8 years before women got the vote in the United States after that. So that was Abdu'l-Bahá and the issue of equality of men and women. He spoke to several large women's groups, I think several thousand women in Chicago. He was very concerned about war and peace. 6 times in North America, in New York City, in Milford, Pennsylvania, in Montreal, in Buffalo, Omaha, and Sacramento. 6 times he said that Europe was a powder keg and a great war was coming soon to Europe. This idea was almost inconceivable to the people at the time. Most white Protestants maintained that Christian civilization had now achieved a level of enlightenment that meant that a major war was no longer possible. They had Christianized civilization. and because they had Christianized civilization, and because they're white, and the white people understand these things better than anyone else, that a major war was not possible. World War I, as a result, was a severe shock to white Protestant intellectuals. The fact that Christian Germans and Christian French and Christian English were all killing each other was a major blow to this idea of racial and cultural and religious superiority that I've mentioned to earlier. And then, of course, World War II and the effort to emphasize the superiority of the Aryan race over others was the final nail in the coffin in racial superiority in terms of it being an acceptable public idea. After World War I, white Protestantism switched from emphasizing optimistic progress to emphasizing original sin, which, as you can imagine, is the sort of the opposite idea of the optimism that existed before the war. And Abdu'l-Bahá was one of the very few people who saw this possibility coming. Swami Vivekananda, who was also a little earlier traveling around, also commented about the buildup of the arms race in Europe, but he didn't say there was going to be a war. He just said, "Oh, they're building up their arms a lot." I haven't even seen anybody else complaining or worrying about it. Abdu'l-Bahā's ideas had some influence on non-Bahá'í people. Not too much amongst the white people in the United States, a little bit, but not a lot. His biggest impact was really on the African American community in the United States. There was a British biblical scholar, Thomas Kelly Shaney, who became a Baha'i as a result of Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to the United Kingdom. And he then wrote a book called The Reconciliation of Races and Religions. So this was one person who was well known and was a good scholar who became a Baha'i. At Stanford University, there was a professor who heard Abdu'l-Bahá speak at that university, Albert Léon Guérard. He was a Frenchman originally who taught French and English literature at Stanford. And after Abdu'l-Bahā's visit, he became a strong supporter of world government. He talked a lot about the importance of a world language. And after World War II, he even helped draft a world constitution, which of course nobody paid any attention to. So he was another person who was clearly influenced by Abdu'l-Bahá in his thinking as well. But the African American community was probably impacted the most. The leading African American magazine at that time was The Crisis. It was published monthly by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the leading African American intellectuals and writers at that time. And in the May issue of 1912, he had Abdu'l-Bahá as the man of the month. The June issue covered Abdu'l-Bahā's visit. And then when Abdu'l-Bahá passed in 1921, his passing was mentioned also in an issue of The Crisis. W.E.B. Du Bois's first wife became a Baha'i. And then later on, she and he divorced. And he remained in contact with the Baha'i community for the rest of his life, with sometimes positive attitudes towards the Baha'i faith and sometimes more negative attitudes, because he was not one who wanted to sort of focus exclusively on world problems, because his own people obviously had severe problems. So he was very concerned about supporting the development of the African American community. Another important African American who also became a Baha'i after Abdu'l-Bahā's visit was Robert Abbott. He was the publisher of the Chicago Defender, which people called America's Black newspaper. It was one of the most prominent newspapers published by African Americans in the United States. Another prominent one, by the way, was the Washington Bee, published in Washington, D.C., and it covered Abdu'l-Bahā's visit quite extensively as well. Robert Abbott became a Baha'i in the 1930s, about the time he retired from running the Chicago Defender. All of this made it possible for Alain Locke to hear about the faith and become a Baha'i. He himself did not meet Abdu'l-Bahá in 1912. He later on became a professor of philosophy at Howard University. He had been previously got his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University. He went to Oxford for a year, and there, with a American Jewish background, whose name now escapes me, they talked a lot about the idea of multiculturalism. And the idea of multiculturalism as an intellectual idea that then got written down and written about came from those meetings of the two of them in Oxford. So this is quite an interesting contribution Alain Locke makes before he becomes a Baha'i. Became a Baha'i in 1918, and it strengthened his efforts to bring about interracial unity. And he remained an active Baha'i throughout his life. He wasn't centrally active because he was doing a lot of other things. He was one of the leading figures. He was often called the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, which of course was this major outpouring of African-American literary output, music, art criticism. It was really the beginning of an African-American intellectual movement that was quite large and significant, the Harlem Renaissance, and Alain Locke was central to that and was a Baha'i at that point. Abdu'l-Bahá also helped to build the American Baha'i community in some very important ways. It had between 1,000 and 2,000 members at the time he arrived. He had the governing bodies of the Chicago and New York Baha'i communities re-elected and reorganized in order to strengthen them. He met with them to talk to them about how local Baha'i communities should be organized. And of course, on May 1st, 1912, he laid the cornerstone for the beautiful Baha'i temple in Wilmette, Illinois, the first Baha'i temple in this country, so far the only one in this country, and it was the second Baha'i temple built in the world. It's the oldest one that still exists because the other one was destroyed in the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s. He had quite an impact on the membership of the Baha'i community. There were something like 50 people who became Baha'is during his visit, but many of the veteran Baha'is had to think very deeply about what it meant to be a Baha'i, and it changed their understanding of the faith in profound ways. I think maybe the best example of that to me is Howard McNutt, who, like I mentioned, this movie was made in his backyard, and you'll see African-American people there in his backyard, including African-American children. Howard McNutt in the 1906 wrote horribly racist things to some of his Baha'i friends that I've seen in the archives. So clearly by 1912, with Abdu'l-Bahā's influence, he realized that that had to change. And in fact, Howard McNutt died in Miami, where he had retired, going to a meeting that he had organized in the African-American part of town to teach the faith there in that part of the city. So Howard McNutt is a good example of someone who really made a major change of their life because of Abdu'l-Bahā's visit. Many of the young Baha'is, many of the children, if you ask them when they became Baha'is, they'll say, oh, I became a Baha'i in 1912. I met Abdu'l-Bahá when I was 3, when I was 5, when I was 12. So it had a big impact on the young Baha'is. And it helped a lot of people to understand that the faith really was a kind of independent religion as well, and not just something to revise or reform existing religions. Where teaching the faith to other people was concerned, he stressed love and service to others very strongly. He encouraged Baha'is to take the faith to new parts of the world, new parts of the country, which many of them did. And it was because of his visit that starting in 1916, he could write the Baha'is of the United States and Canada and send them these 14 letters called the Tablets of the Divine Plan, which gave them a mandate to take the Baha'i faith to the entire world. His visit laid the foundation for those tablets. He probably could have never sent them this advice if he hadn't come and had met them and had deepened them and explained the faith to them, had deepened and strengthened their love and devotion to it. It became their framework for action for really, even to up to this day, the Tablets of the Divine Plan shape the plans for expanding the Baha'i faith. By the way, I'm almost finished here. His talks to Baha'i audiences were a little different than his talks to the general public. To the Baha'is, he often talked about the Persian believers the persecution and martyrdom that they faced, their steadfastness, their love of Baha'u'llah in spite of their terrible difficulties and hardships. He emphasized to the Baha'is the importance of devoting yourself to spreading the faith, to letting people know about Baha'u'llah and about Baha'u'llah's revelation and his teachings. He emphasized very strongly faithfulness to the Baha'i covenant. The covenant is this promise that the faith will remain organized and united in spite of opposition, in spite of controversy. And he often to the Baha'is talked about the Universal House of Justice, which was the governing body of the faith that was then finally elected in 1963. Interestingly enough, he never mentioned the guardianship. And the reason is because his grandson, who was the future guardian of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, was 15 years old. And he did not want to endanger Shoghi Effendi's life or anybody trying to corrupt him. So he didn't talk about the guardianship, but he talked about the House of Justice. He talked about the importance of obeying Abdu'l-Bahá as the center of the covenant, and he frequently hinted at various things that then were elaborated upon in the Will and Testament, such as the House of Justice. In particular, his last talks in New York City talked about the covenant and talked about the House of Justice and the growth of the faith. So these are some of the things he talked about as he was leaving the country in particular. Also, his last talk in California was very much that way as well. Finally, Abdu'l-Bahā's legacy. Generations of Baha'is were inspired to serve the faith and to serve humanity in ways they never would have been if he hadn't come here. His presence, his personal charisma, his energy, the love that he palpably emitted to people was very transformative and truly moved many people to change their lives. Many people around the world who want to bring about change in the world can be deeply inspired by the teachings that he emphasized in his talks. And these teachings, such as the equality of all people, the oneness of humanity, the need for world peace, are really crucial for the future of humanity. And I would say that even in Iran, the day will come when enlightened people will come to appreciate Abdu'l-Bahā's visit, emphasize his teachings, human rights, equality of the sexes, tolerance of all religions, nonviolence. These are, in fact, some of the very teachings that people are talking about in their demonstrations right now in Iran. The movement that women don't have to cover their hair anymore. The movement that people shouldn't be persecuted because of their religion. These are teachings of the Baha'i faith that are actually sort of unknowingly moving mobs and crowds of people today in Iran as they deal with a very oppressive government. So it's very interesting to see how these ideas of the faith are continuing to spread and continuing to affect the world. So that is my presentation.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Yeah, and I feel like many of us don't know all of these details, so it's really incredible. Thank you. Okay, so the first question is, can you please tell us more about his Montreal visit if you have some more info?
Well, I'd have to pull out my book in order to remember the details. He was there, I believe, 7 or 8 days. At first, he stayed at the home of the Maxwells. Of course, May Maxwell and her husband had become Baha'is. She'd become Baha'i in Paris in the 1890s, 1898, 1899. He became a Baha'i later. Their daughter, of course, was little Mary, who was born in 1909 or 1910, was just about 3 years old when Abdu'l-Bahá came to Montreal. And of course, she later married Shoghi Effendi and had memories of Abdu'l-Bahā's visit. He later moved into a hotel because he didn't want to really sort of put the Maxwells out too much. He spoke at quite a few different public venues, and there were, I don't remember how many newspaper articles generated, but perhaps 20 or so, and perhaps a quarter or a third of them were in French, and the rest were in English newspapers there in the city. When he left Montreal, he then took the train west. The train stopped in Toronto. He supposedly got off the train and walked back and forth on the platform for a little while, but didn't actually stay in Toronto. On his way to Toronto, also, there's the interesting story of a young Mohawk boy sitting on a fence watching the train go by, and he saw this man, white bearded man wearing white clothing, stick his head out of the window and wave at him, which surprised him so much he fell off the fence. And he later became the first indigenous person in Canada to become a Baha'i. And so this is a very interesting story, the story of the lofts. So that's another sort of part of the Canada story that of Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to Canada. I should add that Mr. Loft's grandson, who became a lawyer, was one of the first chair people of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Canada for bringing about reconciliation between First Nations people and the white people in Canada. And he spoke at the Association for Baha'i Studies a few years ago.
Thank you. Do we know why he chose only Montreal from Canada to visit, and why he called the Maxwell's house his home?
Well, Abdu'l-Bahá went to places where there were Baha'is. And so he, for example, never traveled south of Washington, D.C. He never visited any of the southern states, never got to Texas, Arizona. There were no Baha'is there. And so there was nobody there to invite him, nobody there to plan meetings for him. The only city that he visited and spent any time in that there were no Baha'is in was Salt Lake City. He spent a couple of days there because the state fair was going on, and the National Irrigation Congress was going on, and the Mormon Church annual meeting was going on. So the city was thronged with people, and he went to the state fair and he enjoyed it very much, and he picked up plantings and seeds and things to take back to Haifa with him. That's the only city he visited where there were no Baha'is. Everywhere else he was invited. And at that time in Canada, Montreal was the only Baha'i community. There were scattered individual families in Toronto, not in Toronto, in Ontario and Brockville, I think it was. And there was a Baha'i woman living in New Brunswick, but there were no organized Baha'i communities at that time, except in Montreal. And of course, he very much was attached to Mae Bowles Maxwell, and their home, the Maxwell house, is still in its Baha'i property. It's considered a shrine. Abdu'l-Bahá said that people should visit it. So it's a place you can actually visit and do a little kind of mini pilgrimage.
Would you please comment on why Abdu'l-Bahá did not expressly denounce Jim Crow, segregation, and separate but equal during his visit to America?
As I said, what Abdu'l-Bahá tended to do was not to attack or criticize in public, but instead to encourage the opposite. And so Abdu'l-Bahā's modus operandi was not to criticize or attack. His modus operandi was to heal and to love. And that's precisely what he did where the issue of race was concerned. As I said, he pushed interracial marriage, which was illegal in half the states of the United States and was even shocking to the American Baha'is. He spoke to large crowds of African Americans in Washington, D.C. He spoke to mixed race meetings in Chicago. He attended the NAACP annual meeting in Chicago. And I should add, when he was about to leave Chicago to go to California, he invited Fujita, a Japanese immigrant to the United States, to accompany him from Chicago to California. And of course, the big prejudice in California was against Japanese and Chinese people. So he had with him a Japanese American as part of his entourage when he went to California. And this, of course, also helped to break down barriers and to make the Baha'i position clear.
Would you please comment on the role of Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, during Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to America?
That's a very interesting topic, actually. I don't know a lot about it, but Abdu'l-Bahá left his sister in charge of the faith while he came to the West. And so she was there. I think probably there were no pilgrims or very few pilgrims coming because Abdu'l-Bahá wasn't there at the time. But she was the one who made sure that everything was running fine in Haifa and Akka. He was sending her letters frequently about how things were going. And he often sent newspaper clippings as well. He sent newspaper clippings with translations to Iran, by the way, so that people in Iran would hear about the growth of the faith in America as well. So she was really left in charge. That was also true after his passing when Shoghi Effendi went to Switzerland.
I would be interested in what you think is the reason that Abdu'l-Bahá's far more successful tour of America was less well known years later than were the visits by various speakers from India.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And you know, there's several other individuals who came to America. And in my book, Abdu'l-Bahá in America, I cover their trips as well, but briefly. The most prominent was probably Swami Vivekananda, who came to the United States for the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893. And he stayed and then actually came back, I think at least one or more times, maybe two more times. And he passed away in either 1899 or 1900 in India. So he died quite young because of diabetes. Swami Vivekananda had a big impact on American religion. And he had a big impact for two reasons, I think you could say. First of all, Swami Vivekananda arrived at a time when religion in the minds of most Americans was divided into Christianity and paganism. And even the comparative religion texts that were available at the time made a distinction between Christianity, which was a universal religion, and the others, quote, ethnic religions. They were all preparations for people to become Christian. That was the attitude and understanding about world religions. So Swami Vivekananda, when he spoke at the Parliament in Chicago, it blew people away. First of all, he wasn't some ignorant pagan. He could quote Western philosophers with great articulateness. So he was a brilliant thinker, a brilliant speaker, and the fact that he wasn't a Christian was therefore quite puzzling to people. How could someone who was smart not be a Christian, you know? And the other thing about Swami Vivekananda is quite the contrast to Abdu'l-Bahá, is that he criticized in public. He even insulted sometimes. He was very strong in his comments. You think that Hinduism is this terrible pagan thing, and we have our widows burned on the funeral pyres of their husbands, and we throw our children to the crocodiles and we don't know what to do with them. This is not a common thing. These are very rare things. Any society have these problems. What about all the alcoholism in your society, all the unemployment in your society, all of the discrimination in your society, all the inequality in your society? So he dished it right back out at the missionaries. He said the missionaries were ruining India because they were bringing in liquor, for example, and this was a time when people were very worried about alcohol in the United States. He was very controversial. And people had to listen to him and realize that, well, Hindus, Hindoos, that's how they spelled it. Hindus perhaps weren't so dumb after all. So that's why Vivekananda had a big impact. When Abdu'l-Bahá came 20 years later, that had passed. People were beginning to realize, oh, these other religions, okay, yeah, they're not Christianity, and maybe they're not completely true, but they're not just simply pagan superstition. So Abdu'l-Bahá didn't have that foil, and then Abdu'l-Bahá didn't criticize. Other teachers mostly came at the same time. Swami Vivekananda. Dharmapala was the great Buddhist teacher from Sri Lanka, and he was a kind, quiet man who impressed people very much. Swami Vivekananda, by the way, was probably the man who introduced yoga to Americans. And they say his first yoga classes were at Greenacre, though I don't know if you can prove that. So Swami Vivekananda had quite a big impact, more so than Abdu'l-Bahá. But Abdu'l-Bahā's message and his visit, I think, ultimately will have more recognition. it's quite interesting. Vivekananda, when he left the United States, he had maybe had 100 followers, maybe 2 or 3 little communities of followers, and the Vedanta Society still exists. It's in the United States. It's got maybe 1,000 members, so it's still around. But if you want to reconstruct Swami Vivekananda's travels in America, it's extremely difficult. He didn't have any people around him who were members who wrote it down. So you have to go find all the newspaper articles. And there's this one lady, Marie Louise Burke, who's devoted her whole life to practically burning out her eyesight, going through all of the microfilms of newspapers, trying to find where he spoke and when he was in each town and city. An immense labor of love that we don't have to do because we have all that information in our archives.
Could you say more about Fujita?
There's not a lot I can say about Fujita. I never met him. You know, he passed 70s in. There are probably people on this screen today who might have met him because if they'd gone on pilgrimage in the 70s, they had a good chance to have met him. He came to the United States in about 1902, if I remember right, 1903. You can read more about him in O.Z. Whitehead's book, Some Early Baha'is of the West, or his second volume. I can't remember the title of the second volume, and Fujita is talked about in one of them, and Yamamoto, Kenichi Yamamoto is talked about as well. These are 2 Japanese people who came to the United States very young. If I remember right, Fujita was at some point, worked for Helen Goodall, and then of course came to Chicago and worked for Corinne True for a while in Chicago. Then when he traveled with Abdu'l-Bahá to the West Coast, I don't remember what he did, but then Abdu'l-Bahá invited him to Haifa. So I think probably after World War I, Fujita came to Haifa, and he was in Haifa right up to about the time World War II began. Then he was back in Japan during the war and then returned to Haifa after the war. And so he knew Abdu'l-Bahá. I think he was there when Abdu'l-Bahá passed. And one of the last people alive in Haifa who knew Abdu'l-Bahá and there from the sort of early days of Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry, middle days of Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry. Quite a remarkable man, very short, 4 foot something. But quite a remarkable man.
Thank you.
That's the best I can remember because I haven't read about him for some years, you know.
Did Abdu'l-Bahá believe that his trip to America was a success?
I'd say yes. Yes and no. Well, at least yes. You know, the American Baha'i community is always a work in progress. And whether we progressed as far as he might have liked while he was here, I don't know. But his visit made the Tablets of the Divine Plan possible and made, in many ways, the building of the administrative order under the Will and Testament possible, or much more possible. The American Baha'i community was prepared by his visit for those 2 major developments. And I think from that point of view, it was a great success.
Thank you. Can you tell us more about the young Mohawk boy who became the first First Nations Baha'i?
Well, like I said, his last name was Loft. I can't remember his first name right offhand. And there's an entire book, I think it's called Return to Tyendinaga, which was published about him and his wife Melba. They went pioneering to the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve in Quebec and helped to establish the faith there on that Mohawk Reserve. Today we would call it a reservation in the United States. In Canada, they're called reserves. And he devoted his life to teaching the faith to Indigenous people in Canada. I don't know when he passed, probably in the 60s or 70s, maybe even the 80s, but I'm not sure. I haven't read the book. I have it, but I haven't read it.
I think that's all the questions. Thank you. Everyone really enjoyed this, so we really appreciate your time.
Good. I'm delighted to have a chance to summarize some of this stuff about Abdu'l-Bahá.
Thank you. And our speaker next week will be Mr. Kelly Whalen, and he'll be talking about ethics and corporations from a Baha'i perspective. So again, these are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I put the link to our mailing list and YouTube channel in the chat. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.